Okay, so let's quickly review the aggregate demand model, then develop the aggregate supply curve, and then put the two of them together. So the aggregate demand curve, we'll recall, is coming from our model of the real side of the economy, where we had planned expenditure equal to consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. That's our main macroeconomic identity. Then we have a consumption function, which we can follow Mishkin and write as C plus MPC times Y. Let's ignore tax rates for now. Plus little c times r. We have an investment function. We'll just keep it. So my recording accidentally stopped there, so I kept on writing and talking and didn't know it was no longer recording. So we'll pick up where we left off somewhere on this slide. So we have our our planned expenditures consisting of our four components: consumption, investment, net exports, and government spending, and we've got some very simple versions of them now. And together that will enable us to derive the IS curve, where we assume that GDP is equal to planned expenditure. So we have GDP and then equal to planned expenditure, all of its components. We gather terms, the exogenous components of spending, C bar, I, and X, and G. This should be I bar here. And then we take the MPC Y term over to the other side, and then we have common factor 1 minus MPC, and that's what we divide by, and that's our simple multiplier here. And then our other component is the terms on the interest rate, and so we get this relationship then between the interest rate and GDP, and that's the IS curve. The interest rate, however, this real interest rate, is determined by the Federal Reserve according to the monetary policy rule, so we can just plug that in. Then we have a relationship between the inflation rate and the level of GDP. And that's what we call the aggregate demand curve, the relationship between inflation and GDP. Remember that the aggregate demand curve slopes downwards because an increase in inflation leads to an increase in the real rate of interest, which leads to a decline in investment, decline in consumption spending, decline in net exports, because the exchange rate appreciates when the interest rate goes up, so our net exports fall. That leads directly to a decrease in GDP, and then through the multiplier, a larger decrease in GDP. So that's why we have a negative relationship. When the interest rate goes up, GDP goes down. But that doesn't tell us where the interest rate comes from. For that, we need the aggregate supply curve. So we derive the aggregate supply curve from the Phillips curve, which had a relationship between wage inflation, and hence more general inflation, and unemployment rate. So the Phillips curve said that inflation, wage inflation, broader inflation, depends negatively on the unemployment gap. When there's a big unemployment gap, there's a negative inflation. So this actually should be a minus sign here, right? When unemployment is high, inflation will be low. So I made a little mistake there. Now, by Okun's law, there's a straightforward relationship between the unemployment gap that we have here and the gap between GDP and potential GDP. So we can take that to use for our aggregate supply curve, where we have inflation depending on expected inflation, then some relationship with the GDP gap. So now it's positive when GDP is high relative to potential unemployment is low, and so the price level starts to rise. And so that's why we have a positive relationship between the GDP gap and inflation. And then we have some price shocks that might happen here, sigma. So we have a positive aggregate supply curve when GDP is higher. As GDP gets higher, then the GDP might get closer and closer to potential, it might get above potential, the labor market gets tighter, and workers demand higher wages, and firms translate those or pass those through to higher prices, so that's why we get inflation. So that's the aggregate supply curve. We put them together, and we have, just draw this again, an aggregate supply curve and an aggregate demand curve, pretty straightforward. equilibrium level of inflation and GDP, what I was doing up here is that level of GDP could be below the potential level of GDP, and if that's the case, then what we're seeing is if there's an output gap, GDP is below potential, then the aggregate supply curve shifts downwards every period until we finally get, so we shift here and then here and then here, until we finally get to equilibrium, the long run equilibrium with a lower level of inflation, and now GDP is equal to potential. So that's the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve very quickly.